will mainly present an institutional analysis of Karnataka and Bihar's electricity sectors. So, European energy policy is driven by three goals. They want their electricity to be affordable, they want it to be sustainable, and they want it to be secure. Now, how do you ensure affordability? In Europe, the idea is that competition is the best way to ensure that that electricity is attained in the most at the least cost. So the European Commission has been working towards what it calls a single internal market for electricity for several decades now, since the 1970s. Now this is based on the idea that only if electricity can flow freely without any technical or regulatory barriers across Europe, can energy producers provide the best prices. As we all know, Europe is also committed to the idea of sustainability. They were amongst the first to announce that they want to decarbonize their energy sectors by 2050, decarbonize their economy by 2050. So a part of this goal of decarbonization is through promoting renewable energy technologies, and they do that by subsidizing certain technologies. And that's the part of the renewable energy transition that I will focus on. Just to complete the loop, they're also very worried about security. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean to be secure in terms of energy? As India, if we were to depend on a neighboring country for all our energy purposes, that would make us very, very vulnerable. And similarly in Europe as well, can you imagine Germany being entirely dependent on France for their energy purposes? No. So self-sufficiency and safeguarding their sovereignty is also a very important goal. And these goals are not always congruent with each other. Now, the very idea of a market, it runs counter to the idea of subsidies. And so, can support schemes ever be market-based? Can subsidies be market-based? What does that mean? How would that look? Now, before I go into the specifics of this incongruency, let me give you a brief background of what the electricity market is and its peculiarities. How many of you are familiar with an electricity market and liberalization of the electricity market? Nobody? 3 people? Okay. So the background is that in most parts of the world, electricity, the generation, transmission, and distribution aspects were handled by a single company. So it was in economics, they call it a vertically integrated setup. So, and even in India, up until 2003, most places in India were structured along these lines. That is, all 3 aspects of the electricity sector were handled by the single electricity board. But then the economists came in and said, look, this is not the best way to organize the sector. We can make it more efficient, we can make it more affordable and cheap. So what they did was that they broke up the sector into three separate segments, let's say. So the generators, they said, can compete against each other. If I can provide a new technology which is cheaper than the existing technology, then I should be the one who wins in the market. And I'm also providing something cheaper for the consumers. So they decided to organize the sector in a way that there is competition between the generators, and then they sold their energy directly to the supply companies, who are basically companies whose only job it is to buy power from the generators and sell it to the consumers, you and me, or industries, and people like that. In the middle, you have transmission and distribution. Now, these sectors are what are called, segments are what are called natural monopolies, and they cannot be subject to competition. So, can you have two transmission lines competing against each other? That does not make sense. So, a regulator was put in place to regulate only those aspects of the energy sector which do not deal, which cannot be subject to competition. And then they put in place markets or various trading mechanisms to ensure that the buyer and the seller can trade, basically. But electricity is not like onions, right? You can't go to a market and buy an onion. Electricity has to be bought the minute, or the minute it is produced, it has to be used. So how do you organize the economics of that? And so what happened was they organized the market in several different phases. So buyers and sellers can have long-term contracts. Buyers and sellers can trade one day before the actual electricity is, they call it gate closure. The actual electricity is produced and consumed. So that's the day-ahead market. And then you also have intraday market and balancing market, because as you go closer and closer to the actual time of the transaction, there are fewer and fewer uncertainties about the demand and about the supply. In Europe, at least in Germany and the Netherlands, about 40% of trade happens through the day-ahead market, and about a large part, about also 30 to 40%, I think, also happens through bilateral contracts, so long-term contracts. Now, what happens when renewables come into the mix? What happens is that as renewables enter the mix, because renewables bid at zero, because their variable costs are zero, they push the supply curve to the right. So this is, before that, let me tell you what a supply curve is, basically. So if you want the cheapest set of products, you stack them up in the order of price, right? So that's what is happening here. Hydro is cheap, coal is the next most expensive, and then there's gas, and then at the demand curve, you get the price at which, when the demand curve meets the supply curve is the point at which the price is calculated. What happens when renewables enter the mix? The supply curve gets pushed to the right, as you see, because they have zero variable cost, and that leads to the price becoming lower. So on average, electricity prices drop. Now when electricity prices drop, this is a problem because it might not, electricity price is what gives revenue to the producers. And if it's not enough revenue, they will not make investments in the future. So the market stops creating incentives for future investment, or is not creating enough of an incentive for future investment. So these are the problems. This problem is called the merit order effect. And this, in Europe, when the markets are interconnected, this merit order problem spreads across countries. Germany has a lot of renewables. The electricity price drop from Germany spreads to the Netherlands as well. And so, what are the dynamics related to this spreading of the merit order? And so the objective of my PhD research, or one part of my PhD research, was to understand what these interactions are between the electricity market and renewable spot market, renewable subsidy schemes. And so I divided that into two simple research questions, not so simple to answer them, but the first question deals with the method, what theoretical frameworks did I use to explore subsidy design in the context of the electricity market, and the second question is to operationalize these interactions through a model and identify what the effects are. And so how did I go about doing this? The conventional approach to answering this question, so if you were an energy planner, if you were sitting in the Ministry of Power and you had to decide what is the best mix for electricity supply in our country, how would you do it? So the way science has been able to contribute to this, researchers have been able to contribute to this, is using optimization models. So an optimization model can tell you, look, over the next 10 years or 20 years, this mix is the least cost mix for power generation. Now this assumes that one can in fact install and optimize, or in the ideal world, they could install sort of an optimized energy mix. But we don't live in an ideal world. And so these are examples of energy models that have been used to simulate the electricity system. This is a list of models that are very popular, and these are the sort of time horizons, 2050, 2030, and these are some of the results. So it says under certain assumptions, this is how the energy system will look. Now, the problem with this is, as you can imagine, investment decisions happen under a great amount of uncertainty. Even if you were to buy a mobile phone, there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, does it make sense to wait for the next year until the price costs reduce on the mobile phone? Or maybe you get better features, or maybe it's not worth the wait. So imagine when you make a decision about an investment in a power plant, do you know whether the demand will actually grow enough to make the case for the power plant? And so there's a lot of uncertainty that goes into each investment decision, and that's what we try to model in our energy model. We use an agent-based modeling and simulation, and which is a form of computational social science that enables one to model individual entities and their interactions with the environment. So you only model decision making at the individual level, and then you arrive at emergent macro level patterns. These models have been used to model socio-technical systems such as energy systems, transportation systems, industrial complexes, etc. Now, at Delft University, we built over a period of 5 to 7 years, a lot of PhD students were involved, and we built this model called the Electricity Energy Modeling Laboratory, where energy producers are agents who make mainly two decisions in the core component and the core components in the model. So they make decisions about bidding into the electricity market, and they make decisions about investments. And they make decisions about investments by calculating their NPVs. Each energy agent, producer agent, calculates their NPV, and NPV stands for net present value, which is basically a cost-benefit analysis. While the costs are known to the energy producer, the benefits there's a lot more uncertainty related to that. So what these energy producer agents did was that they made little forecasts based on the past data in the model. So the model would run for about 50 years, but each agent at each time step would look back and say, gas prices have been increasing like this, coal prices have been increasing like this, and so I expect, under uncertainty, I expect that these prices will increase, or forecast these prices, and then they would make an investment decision under uncertainty. So, and in this way, we incorporated what is known as bounded rationality, imperfect foresight into the model. And a lot of data and assumptions go into the model. So this is how the load curve was represented. What you see here is the total number of hours in a year on the x-axis. And that is divided into 20 load segments, and each load segment is cleared as a separate market. And a lot of assumptions about costs of the power generation technologies, costs of fuels, like that. And I also had to model renewable support schemes as well. So every country in Europe has its own sort of support scheme. And what I did was I went around identifying core characteristics of these support schemes. So I listed out all the support schemes in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and I identified certain characteristics with using which these support schemes could be represented. And I picked 3 of them that I thought were important. One of them is a quantity warranty versus a price warranty. Now, when policies are set in economics, the regulator either sets up the quantity. So, for instance, if they say, I want to buy X amount of power that's only from renewables, so that's the quantity warranty. On the other hand, they say, if you give me power from a certain technology, for this technology, I will pay you a certain price. So that's price warranty. So these are 2 different ways of. And then another design element was how these subsidies were designed in relationship to the electricity market price. Now, what is a subsidy? A subsidy is basically the difference between the cost of the technology and the price the revenue that the technology can get. So you only need a subsidy because the revenue is not enough to cover the cost of the technology, right? So, but the electricity market price is what decides the revenues, and there's uncertainty in that. So how do you deal with this uncertainty? You can either assume that you know what the electricity price is going to be. These are 2 stylistic possibilities. So you can decide that the subsidy designer can say, okay, I assume that the electricity price is going to be X, and based on that I will give you a fixed subsidy across 10 years or whatever the contract length is. On the other hand, you can say, I will change the subsidy as I go along, depending on the electricity price. If the electricity price increases, I will give you the difference between the cost and the price at that point. So, and then the other design element that I implemented was the technology specificity versus neutrality. So, yeah, we can come back to this later, but I'll go to the results now. And what you see in this figure is on the y-axis you see subsidy costs, and on the x-axis you see the various design elements of the renewable support scheme. So if a renewable support scheme was designed in a certain, with these characteristics, then what would the subsidy cost be? And I found that if the electricity price is taken into account before, so we assume what the electricity price is going to be and then we design a subsidy, that works out to be more expensive for the government because the government or most people forecasting these prices assume that prices are going to remain roughly the same or based on what it has been for the last several years. What they don't incorporate is the drop in the prices as renewables enter the mix. And so there is some literature which supports this assumption. It's called the anchoring effect. So you assume, when you're thinking about the future, you assume that it's going to look more or less like this. Okay. And so that effect led to a 15% impact on the total subsidy cost. And so this is one result. other results, this figure shows how the different technologies were invested in under different support schemes. And this figure shows whose welfare changed to what extent. So how much did the consumer pay, how much did the producer earn, how much under each of the support schemes. So I can go into detail later if you like, but this is just to show you the sort of results that the model could produce. And so a summary, I identified renewable support schemes, and identified in terms of their design elements. I modeled it alongside an electricity market model and an investment module, an endogenous investment module, and I used agent-based modeling, which enabled the incorporation of bounded rationality for investment decisions. And I showed how uncertainties about prices can have tangible impacts on welfare distribution. And there were some other applications as well. Now I will go on to the India part of my work. So how is Europe similar or different to India? It is similar in the sense that we are a collection of sort of independent states, and each state has each state is also worried about sovereignty, just like in Europe. And they don't want the government or other states telling them, too much what to do. But we have a stronger set of institutions, obviously, that hold us together. And what we don't have is as much trade between states. So in India, most of our transactions happen through long-term power purchase agreements, and historically they've developed as power purchase agreements between producers and consumers within a state. Although a power exchange was introduced about 10 years ago, and the grid became a single grid which operates in frequency, only about 3 or 4% of all transactions take place on the power exchange. Now, in that sense, we operate more in islands. So, what you see in the newspapers is that we're going to have a lot of renewables coming in, 175 gigawatts by 2022, 400 gigawatts of these targets. An independent rating agency, CRISIL, says that we're going to miss our 2022 renewable targets by a massive 42%. And apart from this, there are also other issues. So there's discoms that suffer a lot of financial stress, and even with government efforts such as the Uday scheme to help infuse discoms with funds and to help make them more efficient, the discom losses in many parts of the country still rise. So, with this background, let's go back to the institutional setup. Most of our supply companies, which are also, so in Europe, supply companies and distribution companies were separate. But in India, both supply and distribution is taken care of by the same entity. And so this entity is also regulated, heavily regulated. And then, of course, almost half of our generation companies are also regulated. distribute electricity. There are proposals to separate those two functions, but it's highly unlikely that that is possible in India, mainly because our consumer base has massive inequalities, and there's a large part of our consumer base which simply can't afford electricity, and therefore the distribution companies have to be regulated, because somebody has to say, okay, tariffs are going to remain low, and we're going to make sure that the companies the distribution companies retain, get back its costs. And so it's important that distribution companies remain regulated in India. So we're a liberalized electricity sector, but only partly. There is competition amongst some of the generators. And within this framework, there's lots of dynamics. There's a new, the CERC has proposed a market-based economic dispatch. There are problems with long-term allocation of costs and risks between consumers and producers. And what role should distribution companies play as we have more and more renewables coming into the mix? So these are all important questions. Let me talk a little more about the long-term allocation of cost, benefit, and risk. Now, in India, like I mentioned earlier, about 90% of all our transactions happen through long-term contracts, which means that a distribution company decides, look, I will need electricity from a generation company for the next 20-25 years. And the tariff structure, the contract is structured in a way that fixed costs are going to be paid throughout those 20-25 years. While the variable costs are, the variable costs can change, and that depends on how much the producer actually generates. Now, where is the risk going in this? What happens when suddenly the demand is not as high as you expect? Surplus power, yes, but also you end up, the distribution company ends up paying for electricity it doesn't need, and for capacity it doesn't need. And this is a real problem in India. This is part of the reason why distribution companies are under so much stress, because they have contracted long-term capacity with long-term contracts that they can't get out of, and they expected demand, for instance, in Gujarat and Karnataka and other places in the south have had high growth of demand in the past, but now that demand growth is reducing. And so they're all burdened with long-term PPAs that they don't need. So what am I trying to do here? What I wanted to do is understand, sorry about that. What I wanted to do is understand what the institutional setup of trade is in India. So what capabilities and perceptions and what drives the stakeholders in the system to make the decisions they do? Why do they get into long-term contracts under so much uncertainty, even though they take on a lot of risk of uncertain demand? Now, having access to a large pool, more generators in demand, allows the least expensive resource to be used at any given time. Okay. So efficient trade and transparent trade across states is essential for the integration of renewables, because A, it helps balancing out demand and supply across a larger area, and B, it also gives you price signals. And price signals are important because of their informational value. When India became one single grid in 2014, they realized that there was a lot of price difference between the northeast and the south. This indicated that the transmission line is best placed between the northeast and the southern part of the country. So price signals give you important information about where there's more supply, where there's more demand, where you need to make new investments, perhaps in storage, perhaps in new technologies. So price also has informational value. And so, and currently states like Gujarat and Karnataka, which have high renewables, are already going through trouble, because at certain points during the year when their renewable generation exceeds their demand within their state, it's hard to store that energy, mainly because of regulatory barriers. Store that energy in a different state, right, because of regulatory barriers. And so I wanted to find out how distribution utilities operate, what do they think, how do regulators think about these issues. And so I used something called actor-centered institutionalism, which is a framework to identify capabilities and perceptions and preferences of the various actors in the system. I did about 27 elite interviews in Karnataka and Bihar. And these are some findings. Some of these findings may not come as a surprise to you. Our distribution utilities have very rudimentary forecasting abilities. One story that I like to tell is, although I don't mean to put the distribution utilities in a bad light, it just speaks about the limited capabilities, the functions, the roles that the distribution utilities played 20 years ago is different from now in a newer, in a world with more renewables. But when I spoke to the Deputy Director of Trading in Karnataka, she asked me, Madam, can you tell me how to forecast demand or forecast electricity prices tomorrow? So they don't. This is a limitation that can be pretty easily resolved, but it's an important limitation. They don't do scenario analysis. They don't. Especially to identify the relationship between their technical requirements and the economic implications of their decisions, of their technical decisions. So, can they think of other contracting mechanisms? And finally, I also realized that the regulators have a very strong role to play. In Karnataka, the regulators had only allowed for, I think, 2 or 3% of their total transactions to happen through the electricity power exchange, even though it might have been more cost effective for them to buy power from the exchange at certain points in time. So regulators have strong perceptions about how power should be procured and traded, but they do not undertake any analysis themselves. Scenario analysis, is my understanding. And so these perceptions hugely influence what the decision space of the distribution utilities. And another finding was that there's limited liquidity for trading. So there's not enough. So if Karnataka wants to buy power from the power exchange today, because the prices on the power exchange are really cheap, and that works out more cost effective than buying other power. They don't have enough liquidity to carry through that transaction, because they get paid only in a monthly cycle when they collect their revenues from their bills. And so this was another issue that came out. And so what, right? What are the policy recommendations? Improve capabilities, consider alternative forms of regulation such as incentive-based regulation, and to resolve the limited liquidity for trading, a one-time revolving fund from the state government has this constraint and a very useful way of dealing with the situation. And I'm also working on a modeling study. I go through this very quickly, which I just want to mention this study. What I'm doing is identifying more transactions happening through a spot market. So like, although currently 90% of transactions happen through PPAs, the 10% through short-term trading, what if that ratio shifted? And how would that impact the costs and benefits and risks of the distribution companies, the energy producers? And so these results are still under verification. What is the scientific relevance of what I presented? Now I'd like to tell you about a small debate that happened in Nature in September 2019, where there were two op-eds which talked about one, whether climate policy models were useful, and two, it said they actually are useful. So Kevin Anderson here argues that these climate policy models make too many simplifying assumptions in modeling an economic interpretation of behavior. They substitute what is messy and contextual politics in reality with mathematical formalism. Now, he also says that the predictions of many models have not borne out in reality, and then says they're the wrong tool for the job. Now, the other side, Jessica Jewell, mounts a strong defense when she says, look, the role of these models are being able to identify what-if scenarios. So what happens when a certain technological change comes through or certain decisions are made. However, she says that these models are better at emphasizing technological change than social change. And she says that in order to be able to identify whether a certain pathway for transition is feasible or not, whether it can actually happen in reality, these sort of models have to borrow more from other disciplines to give more insight on feasibility and whether a certain pathway is possible. And so I believe that my contribution lies in bridging these two ways of thinking. One, the useful what-if scenarios, and two, trying to make it slightly closer to the social realities. And in the future, in my future research, I'd like to explore methodologies where these two ways of thinking meet, iterative combinations of widely different approaches. So, an institutional analysis with a modeling study, computational social science, or agent-based modeling is an example. Participatory modeling approaches. And these are the works in progress. And I'd also like to extend my research into mobility areas and food, water, energy nexus. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening to me.
Now we would like to have question and answer session.
Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Do you have any clarificatory questions or any questions about, or do you completely disagree with everything I've said? That's also fine.
On the first part of your presentation, could you, in a very precise manner, tell me what are the strengths of agent-based modeling, strengths and weaknesses vis-a-vis your research question? That was, let me finish. That was. Second, how would you look at critically with all this modeling exercise based on neoclassical economics? And third, how would you use defenders? Have you heard defenders? No?
Defenders? Yeah. Oh yes, yes.
Defenders approach vis-a-vis this.
I can
repeat the questions if you want.
Okay. So the first question was how is a critical look at the
So
use of
agent-based
agent-based modeling for this?
No, I'm not saying critical look. Why did you choose agent-based modeling for your particular research question vis-a-vis strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah. So I think agent-based modeling, the strength, as I mentioned, I think is the ability to incorporate non-rational assumptions that come from a non-rational choice approach paradigm. The disadvantages are validation. So if I say yes, the model behaves, behaviors exist in this form, I think it's unless I do a lot of social science analysis or separate sort of interviews and go in depth into understanding behaviors, it's hard to validate there are approaches, there are ways of validating it, but you can only push the model to the extent that that you can validate it. So so sometimes that limits what you can do with the model. The second question I didn't quite understand. The new classical.
Yeah, you mentioned that these are the approaches which emerge from neoclassical mechanism. Am I correct?
You mean the conventional modeling approaches? Yeah, absolutely.
So how would you look at them critically?
How would I look at neoclassical economic models?
Those models, critically.
I think they're very useful in. So if we assume that the world worked according to neoclassical economics, so if we say that if I implement a certain tax or if I implement a certain subsidy, then these decisions will change exactly like this. So in that ideal setup, neoclassical economics is very, very useful to help us understand the range of possibilities. But it's difficult within neoclassical economics and optimization in particular to incorporate any non-rational behavior or even I think even path dependency is harder to incorporate and although neoclassical economics and these optimization models, I think they're very useful for modeling operational issues only at individual market level decisions, but when it involves investments and decisions which have to be taken under more uncertainty and that have huge fixed cost components associated with it, this will lead to big welfare implications which is difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand how policies go wrong in neoclassical economics. So that's the answer to your second question. And your third question, sir? Defenders. As far as I remember, I went through this model several years ago, I think. So as far as I understand, it is an optimization-based model to study energy scenarios for India. Is that right?
Not really.
Okay, then if you can maybe.
Okay. If you have not done that part, it's okay. There's no time. Let other people.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this with you later.
Any other?
So in the first part, when you looked at this agent base, when you looking at for each agent, you are trying to do some kind of optimization.
Each agent optimized their investment decision.
And so of course, you sort of partly answered. My question was then how do you sort of validate and see that the formulation of what you are saying is the agent's way of looking at whether that is actually replicated in a model?
Yeah. So there are a few ways of validating the model. So one is how well does it map with history. So a part of my model, it started from 2013, 2014. So I was able to say that the market prices I could explain the market prices that came out of this model and compare it to the real market prices. So to that extent, the model was representative of reality. Another way of doing this was we actually spoke to energy producers who made investment decisions and said, is this simplification okay? What do you think? So it was some sort of face validation. But you know, like actual investment cycles, I think it's very hard to say whether this is going to be borne out in reality or not. But I think it helps us understand the dynamics to the extent that this model is valid in the way it represents the market structure and decision making to some extent. Then you know, one can argue that optimization models that go into 2050 are also not valid. So you know.
The other thing which when I saw some of the diagrams is you had this kind of where the costs break up. What about the timing? And when you're talking of, let's say, I'm not sure how you handle the fact that certain resources are available in
these targets. An independent rating agency, CRISIL, says that we're going to miss our 2022 renewable targets by a massive 42%. And apart from this, there are also other issues. So there's discoms that suffer a lot of financial stress, and even with government efforts such as the UDAY scheme to help infuse discoms with funds and to help make them more efficient, the discom losses in many parts of the country still rise. So with this background, let's go back to the institutional setup. Most of our supply companies, which are also, so in Europe, supply companies and distribution companies were separate. But in India, both supply and distribution is taken care of by the same entity. And so this entity is also regulated, heavily regulated. And then of course, almost half of our generation companies are also regulated. Although there are proposals to separate the retail, the supply aspect of the distribution company and the pure function of building lines and wires to distribute electricity. There are proposals to separate those two functions and do different, but it's highly unlikely that is possible in India, mainly because our consumer base has massive inequalities, and there's a large part of our consumer base which simply can't afford electricity, and therefore the distribution companies have to be regulated, because somebody has to say, okay, tariffs are going to remain low, and we're going to make sure that the companies the distribution companies retain, get back its costs. And so it's important that distribution companies remain regulated in India. So we're a liberalized electricity sector, but only partly. There is competition amongst some of the generators. And within this framework, there's lots of dynamics. There's a new, the CERC has proposed a market-based economic dispatch. There are problems with long-term allocation of costs and risks between consumers and producers. And what role should distribution companies play as we have more and more renewables coming into the mix? So these are all important questions. Let me talk a little more about the long-term interested in risk. Now, in India, like I mentioned earlier, about 90% of all our transactions happen through long-term contracts, which means that a distribution company decides, look, I will need electricity from a generation company for the next 20-25 years. And the tariff structure, the contract is structured in a way that fixed costs are going to be paid throughout those 20-25 years. While the variable costs are, but what? Well, the variable costs can change, and that depends on how much the producer actually generates. Now, where is the risk going in this? What happens when suddenly the demand is not as high as you expect? Surplus power, yes, but also the distribution company ends up paying for electricity it doesn't need, and for capacity it doesn't need. And this is a real problem in India. This is part of the reason why distribution companies are under so much stress, because they have contracted long-term capacity with long-term contracts that they can't get out of, and they expected demand, for instance, in Gujarat and Karnataka and other places in the south have had high growth of demand in the past, but now that demand growth is reducing. And so they're all burdened with long-term PPAs that they don't need. So what am I trying to do here? What I wanted to do is understand, sorry about that. What I wanted to do is understand what the institutional setup of trade is in India. So what capabilities and perceptions and what drives the stakeholders in the system to make the decisions they do? Why do they get into long-term contracts under so much uncertainty, even though they take on a lot of risk of uncertain demand? Now, having access to a large pool, more generators in demand, allows the least expensive resource to be used at any given time. Okay. So efficient trade and transparent trade across states is essential for the integration of renewables, because A, it helps balancing out demand and supply across a larger area, and B, it also gives you price signals. And price signals are important because of their informational value. When India became one single grid in 2014, they realized that there was a lot of price difference between the northeast and the south. This indicated that the transmission line is best placed between the northeast and the southern part of the country. So price signals give you important information about where there is more supply, where there is more demand, where you need to make new investments, perhaps in storage, perhaps in new technologies. So price also has informational value. And so, and currently states like Gujarat and Karnataka, which have high renewables, are already going through trouble, because at certain points during the year when their renewable generation exceeds their demand within their state, it's hard to store that energy, mainly because of regulatory barriers. Store that energy in a different state, right, because of regulatory barriers. And so I wanted to find out how distribution utilities operate, what do they think, how do regulators think about these issues. And so I used something called actor-centered institutionalism, which is a framework to identify capabilities and perceptions and preferences of the various actors in the system. I did about 27 elite interviews in Karnataka and Bihar, and these are some of the findings. Some of these findings may not come as a surprise to you. Our distribution utilities have very rudimentary forecasting abilities. one story that I like to tell is, although I don't mean to put the distribution utilities in a bad light, it just speaks about the limited capabilities, the functions, the roles that the distribution utilities played 20 years ago is different from now in a newer, in a world with more renewables. But when I spoke to the Deputy Director of Trading in Karnataka, she asked me, Madam, can you tell me how to forecast demand or forecast electricity prices tomorrow? So they don't. This is a limitation that can be pretty easily resolved, but it's an important limitation. They don't do scenario analysis. They don't. Especially to identify the relationship between their technical requirements and the economic implications of their decisions, of their technical decisions. So, can they think of other contracting mechanisms? And finally, I also realized that the regulators have a very strong role to play. In Karnataka, the regulators had only allowed for, I think, 2 or 3% of their total transactions to happen through the electricity power exchange, even though it might have been more cost effective for them to buy power from the exchange at certain points in time. So regulators have strong perceptions about how power should be procured and traded, but they do not undertake any analysis themselves. Scenario analysis, is my understanding. And so these perceptions hugely influence what the decision space of the distribution utilities. And another finding was that there's limited liquidity for trading. So there's not enough. So if Karnataka wants to buy power from the power exchange today, because the prices on the power exchange are really cheap, and that works out more cost effective than buying other power. They don't have enough liquidity to carry through that transaction because they get paid only in a monthly cycle. When they collect their revenues from their bills. And so this was another issue that came out. And so what, right? What are the policy recommendations? Improve capabilities, consider alternative forms of regulation such as incentive-based regulation, and to resolve the limited liquidity for trading, a one-time rewarding fund from the state government has this constraint and very useful way of dealing with the situation. And I'm also working on a modeling study. I go through this very quickly, which I just want to mention this study. What I'm doing is identifying how, if market designs were different, if there were fewer PPAs and more transactions happening through a spot market. So although currently 90% of transactions happen through PPAs and 10% through short-term trading, what if that ratio shifted? And how would that impact the costs and benefits and risk of the distribution companies, the energy producers? And so these results are still under verification. What is the scientific relevance of what I presented? Now I'd like to tell you about a small debate that happened in Nature in September 2019, where there were two op-eds which talked about one, whether climate policy models were useful, and two, it said they actually are useful. So Kevin Anderson here argues that these climate policy models make too many simplifying assumptions in modeling and economic interpretation of behavior. They substitute what is messy and contextual politics in reality with mathematical formalism. Now, he also says that the predictions of many models have not borne out in reality, and then says that they're the wrong tool for the job. Now, the other side what happens when a certain technological change comes through or certain decisions are made. However, she says that these models are better at emphasizing technological change than social change. And she says that in order to be able to identify whether a certain pathway for transition is feasible or not, whether it can actually happen in reality, these sort of models have to borrow more from other disciplines to give more insight on feasibility and whether a certain pathway is possible. And so I believe that my contribution lies in bridging these two ways of thinking. One, the useful what-if scenarios, and two, trying to make it slightly closer to the social realities. And in the future, in my future research, I'd like to explore methodologies where these two ways of thinking meet, iterative combinations of widely different approaches. So, an institutional analysis with modeling study, computational social science, or agent-based modeling is an example. Participatory modeling approaches. And these are the works in progress. And I'd also like to extend my research into mobility areas and food, water, energy nexus. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening to me.
Now we would like to have question and answer session.
Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Do you have any clarificatory questions or any questions about, or do you completely disagree with everything I've said? That's also fine.
On the first part of your presentation, could you, in a very precise manner, tell me what are the strengths of agent-based modeling, strengths and weaknesses vis-a-vis your research question? That's first, let me finish. That's first. Second, how would you look at critically with all this modeling exercise based on neoclassical economics? And third, how would you use defenders? Have you heard defenders? No?
Defenders?
Yeah.
Oh yes, yes.
Defenders approach vis-a-vis this.
I
I can repeat the questions if you want.
Okay. So the first question was how is a critical look at the use of agent-based modeling for this?
No, I'm not saying critical look. Why did you choose agent-based modeling for your particular research question vis-a-vis strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah. So I think agent-based modeling, the strength, as I mentioned, I think is the ability to incorporate non-rational assumptions that come from a non-rational choice approach paradigm. The disadvantages are validation. So if I say yes, the model behaves, behaviors exist in this form, I think it's unless I do a lot of social science analysis or separate sort of interviews and go in depth into understanding behaviors, it's hard to validate there are approaches, there are ways of validating it, but you can only push the model to the extent that that you can validate it. So so sometimes that limits what you can do with the model. The second question I didn't quite understand. The neoclassical.
Yeah, you mentioned that these are the approaches which emerge from neoclassical mechanism. Am I correct?
You mean the conventional modeling approaches?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how would you look at them critically?
How would I look at neoclassical economic models?
Those models, critically.
I think they're very useful in. So if we assume that the world worked according to neoclassical economics, so if we say that, if I implement a certain tax or if I implement a certain subsidy, then these decisions will change exactly like this. So in that ideal setup, neoclassical economics is very, very useful to help us understand the range of possibilities. But it's difficult within neoclassical economics and optimization in particular to incorporate any non-rational behavior or even I think even path dependency is harder to incorporate and although neoclassical economics and these optimization models, I think they're very useful for modeling operational issues only at individual market level decisions, but when it involves investments and decisions which have to be taken under more uncertainty and that have huge fixed cost components associated with it, this will lead to big welfare implications, which is difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand how policies go wrong in neoclassical economics. So that's the answer to your second question. And your third question? Defenders. As far as I remember, I went through this model several years ago, I think. So as far as I understand, it is an optimization-based model to study energy scenarios for India. Is that right?
Not really.
Okay, then if you can
It's
maybe.
okay. If you have not done that part, it's okay. There's no time. Let other people.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this with you later.
Any other?
So in the first part, when you looked at this agent base, when you're looking at for each agent, you are trying to do some kind of optimization.
Each agent optimized their investment decision.
And so, of course, you sort of partly answered. My question was then how do you sort of validate and see that the formulation of what you are saying is the agent's way of looking at whether that is actually replicated in the model?
Yeah. So there are a few ways of validating the model. So one is how well does it map with history. So a part of my model, it started from 2013, 2014. So I was able to say that the market prices I could explain the market prices that came out of this model and compare it to the real market prices. So to that extent, the model was representative of reality. Another way of doing this was we actually spoke to energy producers who made investment decisions and said, is this simplification okay? What do you think? So it was some sort of face validation. But like actual investment cycles, I think it's very hard to say whether this is going to be borne out in reality or not. But I think it helps us understand the dynamics to the extent that this model is valid in the way it represents the market structure and decision making to some extent. Then one can argue that optimization models that go into 2050 are also not valid. So
The other thing when I saw some of the diagrams is you had this kind of where the costs break up. What about the timing? And And when you're talking of, let's say, I'm not sure how you handle the fact that certain resources are available. Reason for that?
Absolutely.
Now, what is the reason for that?
Yeah, because there's uncertainty for the generation companies as well, and they want certainty that their investments will be recovered. That's absolutely a very, very important point, and it's more important in India, I think, than in Europe, because our
We've come to the history of shortage.
yeah.
So the whole idea was to somehow secure reliable supply.
Absolutely.
So the whole thing has been, it's only now that we have this kind of
It's true.
dynamics of, if you expect discount to suddenly change over that mindset.
No, I completely agree, and I want to do work that helps discoms make better decisions. They don't have to take on all the risk either. But they need tools to be able to help manage the risk of prices as well, because that's a big concern for them. They don't know what to do with market prices. But on the other hand, should we completely take away risk from the generation sector? You know, I don't know the answer to what is the best way of distributing this risk. So, but I think some modeling tools can help understand how risks can be shared. For instance, I think. Sorry, sir. If you wanted to respond.
Oh, that's fine. So in the same context, when you talk of, doing these, even with renewables, we're doing a fixed price power purchase agreement for a 25-year period. Do you think renewables should be, in your perspective, should they be must run? Should we have this fixed price, or should renewables also be exposed to this?
I think renewables won't have any problem if it's exposed to the market, because their marginal costs are zero, so they will get into the merit order anyway. I don't think there's a need for a must-run status at all, actually.
You won't have a fixed price. You won't have a
Yeah,
fixed price.
exactly.
I just will add on what is one of the major incentives. You asked the question why long-term pricing is preferred by the players. One of the major incentive is bailouts. Have you heard about it? Now there is a time for fourth bailout of our discoms.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great incentive. They are sure that they are going to get their money back.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct? That's one of the major political factors which it's very difficult to capture
Absolutely.
in any modeling.
Yeah, that's true.
And there are many others, but this is a major one. Now this is time for fourth bailout in last 30 years.
Yeah, but from my conversations with people at discoms, they realize that they're being burdened, and like the Andhra Pradesh recent example at Andhra Pradesh, where they try to renege on their contracts, is a great example of this working, in the opposite direction. The dynamics are that now slowly people are saying, look, we can't take on so much risk, we can't take on all these contracts, they're a huge burden. So there is pushback, but I think the regulators are also very set in their ways of thinking. And a nice difference was between the Bihar's, the two case studies I did, where in Bihar since they have a history of not having their own indigenous supply, they had to rely on central generators more, and so there they buy about 30% of all their power from short-term markets, which is a huge.
Did you see any difference between regulators in Bihar and regulators in Karnataka?
Yeah, so regulators in Bihar told me, look, we're just going to buy the cheapest power. We don't care where it comes from. The regulators in Karnataka were like, no, markets are extremely risky, we can't. And it also comes because in 2012, when there was a shortage in Karnataka, they bought a lot of power from the market, and then the prices were so high.
I'm talking about basic perception.
Yeah. So this was the perception. So the regulators' perception in Karnataka was like, we have been bitten by markets. Markets are bad. We're not going to go into it. Although since 2012, there's been a lot of difference, and market prices have changed. But the regulators don't do that analysis. So the distribution company in Karnataka are like, yeah, we should not have gotten to so many contracts. But the regulators are like, no, we don't want to expose ourselves to the risk of the market.
Okay, thank you.
Just to take over, sort of carry on from the previous question, the part I thought could also be elaborated is on the public finance, the political economy of that. Right? So, as you say, perhaps the pressure on non-renewables is shifting, as you said, right to the right with more renewables. And say in a certain time horizon, 20 years, 25 years, if that shift happens further, then that's in some ways inviting a crisis for the older models, right? Because of pricing issues. So what happens, within your modeling context, what happens when there is further and further issues of public finance, or as was discussed earlier, the subsidies or support from the government? The pressure on the government is going to be increasing with more renewables coming into the market, right? Can that be an argument made and its implication for public finance?
Let me check if I've understood you right. You're saying that there will be more burden on public finance as renewables increase.
Would that happen? I'm just thinking.
I think that yes, true, but then all public finance is their value-based decisions. What I mean is, giving long-term contracts are as bad, in my opinion, to thermal power companies which might not need to generate, but then that happens too, and that's also a drain on public finance. So, how do you compare it? But yes, I do think that long-term contracts that were given for renewables in around 2015 or so were given at a very high and good price. So in that sense, the companies who invested in that at that time made a lot of money, and so in that sense there is a burden for public finance. But I think it's going to reduce as cost of renewables also reduce.
So I have a related question. So, can you hear me? So a related question, I think it's not just public finance, right? Where's the cost of informed power incorporated? Can you tell me? Because I don't know, I'm just asking from you.
You mean the intermittent?
The intermittency.
Yeah, exactly. So there are ways to mitigate that risk. I have to do modeling studies to see how, for instance, ramping up and ramping down of coal is going to increase. Because of the increased ramp up and ramp down, how much is it going to cost them more? In my sense, because they're recovering almost all of their fixed costs, I think they can take a hit from this ramping up and ramping down. But who takes the hit, right? Who does it have? Should it be socialized or not? I don't know. These are questions that we should think.
So right now, in your the way the prices are fixed, like you said, they were day ahead and a week ahead or something. So those costs are based on, they're just market-driven costs, right?
Yeah, they're marginal costs of their generation.
And are the generators stepping up their costs now because of this ramp up and ramp down?
Yes. So in the intraday markets where the ramping up and ramping down happens because of informed power. So as there's the more renewables in the system, the more transactions shifted toward, in Europe, the more transactions shifted closer to gate closure. So there, ramping up and ramping down costs are also sort of incorporated in the bids that the firm power producers have to bid. So when suddenly solar production reduces and coal has to be ramped up, how much does that cost? And they will incorporate that cost in their bid. and so the prices will reflect the cost of ramping up and ramping down.
Can we address this problem by bringing in megawatt scale storage in next
Yeah.
5 years?
5 years, I don't know about that, but
10 years?
the problem with storage is also pricing. Like storage, we don't, even if I owned a storage plant, I wouldn't know at what price to bid, because but yes, if storage comes in, that the price of cost of storage will be reflected in these intraday markets as well. But yeah.
I find that surprising because when solar was going through a free fall, there was a stage, and I have some role in it, where we thought 7 rupees is good enough, and we are looking for viability in our funding. And it went down, came below 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and everybody was happy. At that stage, the bids themselves had asked for solar plus a minimum amount of storage. It could be 1 hour, it could be 2 hours, that the market would have decided. We would have got better, more realistic pricing of the renewable energy with a certain amount of firm power. So that intermittency that she is talking about would have been taken care of.
But sir, how is that reflected in the Indian market? Like how does
No, it didn't happen. The free fall continued.
Yeah, yeah.
Therefore but then the point is it can be taken care of. When you are talking of storage, the question is if you see solar PV and storage cost started coming down almost in tandem. So therefore when he says next 5 years, the idea is, are you optimistic about storage as a possibility or are you pessimistic? And more importantly, does your model factor that in?
Yeah, I think we are talking about two different, in my head I was talking about referring to the intraday markets, day ahead markets and all of that. But here with these auctions that you're talking about, they're long-term contracts, and so there's no worry about whether the revenue comes from the intraday market in this context. But yeah, I didn't know that the storage and solar prices were going down at tandem in India, so that's interesting.
No, it's everywhere. It's a worldwide phenomenon. If you look at the storage cost reduction, just as PV is coming down, it's not exactly in tandem in terms of the causality, but storage costs are coming down hugely. Therefore, its implication in the next 5 to 10 years becomes an important factor in any model.
Absolutely, I agree.
Keep it for that. Just one quick question when you are talking about this long-term contract being made and now the demand is sluggish. What one wonders is it demand is less because our energy intensity of GDP is going down, or is the demand itself going down, or are we much better at demand side management? So I say, okay, I don't need your electricity. So would you say that the economy is doing badly, or we are becoming more energy efficient?
Very political question.
India has one of the world's highest demand elasticities, so we are, I think that has been the case for a long time now. And there is also evidence to show that the industrial activity has actually contracted over the last quarter or so, and so that has directly led to a drop in electricity demand as well. But I think that there are parts of, after the Saubhagya scheme, parts in the northeastern region, so UP and Bihar, demand has been increasing quite highly in those places. But it's hard to say.
What is the share of that demand into overall demand of India?
That is a good question.
It's a very minuscule.
Uh,
That's not important.
Yeah, I don't want to give a number, and I don't. I would.
You don't. You can look at Hegde and Admiral.